January morning. High above frozen fields, the air is thin and metallic. An engine hums steadily at altitude, not rushed, not eager. The cockpit smells of oil and cold steel. Below, the world is muted. Patches of snow, dark rivers, silent roads. The pilot does not fidget. He does not scan wildly for glory. His eyes move with precision, checking instruments, counting seconds, measuring distance. Other men had laughed at him on the ground. They called him slow, a reader, a man who carried notebooks where others carried stories. Ahead, six dark shapes cut across the pale sky. Enemy fighters, tight formation, confident. They have numbers. They expect instinct panic reaction. What they do not see is calculation unfolding quietly behind calm eyes. Angles, energy, patience. The pilot adjusts his throttle by a fraction. Not to attack yet, but to invite pursuit. In the coming minutes, speed and arrogance will collide with preparation, and the outcome will not favor the loudest voices. To understand how this moment became possible, we must step back into the air war that shaped men like him. By the time this January morning arrived, the war in the air had already shed its illusions. The early months of the Second World War had proven that air combat was no longer romantic. It was mathematical, it was mechanical, and it punished those who relied on habit more than understanding. Across Europe and the Pacific, air forces entered the conflict carrying doctrines born in the previous decade. Many were rooted in experience from the First World War or in interwar theories that promised decisive victory through aggression alone. Fighters were trained to close distance quickly, to turn hard, to outmaneuver the enemy through instinct and courage. The idea of the lone ace still dominated training halls and propaganda reels. Reality was less forgiving. By 1940 and 1941, air combat had become a contest of energy management, altitude control, and formation discipline. A fighter's performance was no longer defined solely by how tightly it could turn, but by how well its pilot understood speed as stored energy. Every climb was a withdrawal from a bank account, every dive a deposit. Pilots who failed to think in these terms often found themselves trapped, slow, low, and hunted. The major air powers learned these lessons unevenly. The German Luftwaffe entered the war with a highly professional corps. Its pilots were trained extensively in formation flying, mutual support, and tactical flexibility. The Schwarm and Rot formations emphasized situational awareness and allowed pairs of fighters to operate independently while supporting one another. In the opening campaigns over Poland and France, this system proved devastating, but success bred certainty. As victories accumulated, Luftwaffe doctrine began to harden. Pilots trusted that aggression and experience would carry them through. Numerical advantage reinforced this belief. When German fighters encountered lone or outnumbered opponents, the expectation was simple: press the attack, force a turning fight, overwhelm. Other air forces struggled to adapt. British pilots during the Battle of Britain were trained under immense pressure, often with limited hours. American air doctrine, still evolving, emphasized formations and firepower, sometimes at the expense of individual maneuverability. In the Pacific, Japanese naval aviators initially possessed unmatched experience and discipline, but their doctrine favored close-range dogfighting and undervalued pilot survivability. Across all sides, one truth emerged: the sky rewarded those who could think faster than they reacted. Aircraft technology amplified this divide. Fighters like the Messerschmitt Bf-109, the Supermarine Spitfire, the Mitsubishi A6M0, and later the North American P-51 Mustang, each carried strengths and vulnerabilities. Speed at altitude, roll rate, dive performance, fuel endurance, none of these existed in isolation. They formed a system. A pilot who understood that system could survive encounters that should have been fatal. Most pilots were taught how to fly. Few were taught how to calculate. This gap created tension within squadrons. Aggressive pilots often looked down on those who studied manuals, who asked questions about fuel mixtures or optimal climb rates. Reading was seen as caution, calculation as hesitation. In the mess halls, bravado carried more weight than preparation, yet the war did not care about reputation. It cared about outcomes, and it was within this environment, where confidence often masked rigidity, that a certain pilot developed a different way of fighting, one shaped not by instinct alone, but by study. Quote, A man whose habits made him an outsider, even as the war was quietly reshaping the rules in his favor. To understand why he was underestimated, we must look closer at the man himself. He did not fit the image. In a war that celebrated swagger and speed, he was methodical. Where others spoke in fragments of bravado, he spoke in complete sentences. He arrived early to briefings, stayed late afterward, and asked questions that sounded unnecessary to men eager to fly. He wrote things down. His notebooks were small, practical, and worn at the edges. Inside were not poems or dreams of glory, but figures. Fuel burn at various throttle settings, climb rates at different altitudes, turning radii measured against airspeed, notes on enemy aircraft, where they accelerated, where they bled energy, where they became dangerous. Some pilots memorized these facts. He preferred to understand them. His training record reflected this temperament. He was not the fastest to solo, not the most aggressive in mock dogfights. Instructors described him as a cautious, sometimes with approval, often without. He rarely pushed an aircraft beyond limits without knowing precisely what would happen next. When corrected, he listened. When criticized, he adjusted. Among his peers, this earned a nickname, a bookworm. It was not meant kindly. In squadron culture, flying was a craft proven in the air, not on paper. Pilots who hesitated were suspect. Those who avoided unnecessary risks were labeled conservative, even fearful. The war demanded courage, and courage was often confused with impatience, yet his caution was deliberate. He understood that air combat was not a duel of equals meeting head-on. It was asymmetrical, chaotic, and unforgiving. A single mistake, a misjudged climb, a stalled turn, a moment of fixation could end a career or a life. He studied not to avoid combat, but to control it. Before missions, he visualized engagements that had not yet happened. Not heroic victories, but sequences of motion. If pursued from above, if bounced from behind, if outnumbered, he planned exits as carefully as attacks. This mindset stood in quiet contrast to prevailing attitudes. Many pilots relied on muscle memory developed through repetition. They flew by feel, by instinct. When it worked spectacularly. When it failed, there was rarely time to understand why. He wanted reasons. His aircraft became an extension of this philosophy. He learned its limits intimately, not just the red lines, but the margins. He knew how it behaved when lightly loaded, when heavy with fuel, when the engine ran hot, when the air grew thin. He practiced maneuvers not to perfect them, but to see where they broke down. In combat reports, his early sorties were unremarkable. He did not chase every contact. He disengaged when odds turned poor. Some saw this as a lack of fire. Others began to notice something else. He came back, again and again. While more aggressive pilots filled reports with claims and losses, his record remained steady. No dramatic victories, no dramatic failures. Just survival, observation, and learning. Commanders tolerated him. Wingmen sometimes dismissed him. Enemy pilots never noticed him at all. Not yet. But the air war was evolving. As skies grew more crowded and encounters more complex, the value of calculation increased. Numbers alone no longer guaranteed control. Formation discipline could fracture. Confidence could become predictability, and predictability in the air was lethal. On this January morning, all of that quiet preparation, every note, every question, every measured flight, would converge into a single decision. One that would test whether thinking could truly overcome numbers. The aircraft engines ahead were already turning toward him. 6 of them, and the distance between theory and reality was closing fast. Angle 1. The human factor air combat stripped men down to essentials. There was no room for ego once tracers began to pass the cockpit. Yet ego often arrived first, long before fear or clarity. For pilots like him, the struggle was not only against the enemy, but against perception within his own ranks. Being labeled a bookworm carried weight. It suggested softness, a lack of killer instinct. In a profession where confidence was survival currency, such labels isolated men. He felt it in casual jokes, in the way others volunteered first for patrols, in the subtle assumption that he would follow rather than lead. But isolation also created independence. Unburdened by the need to impress, He flew his own fight. He did not chase affirmation from squadron boards or mess hall stories. His focus remained internal, on what the aircraft was doing, what the enemy was likely to do next, and how time could be stretched in his favor. In the air, this made him calmer than most. Where others felt pressure to act immediately, he allowed seconds to pass. He trusted that patience was not weakness but leverage. This emotional discipline, rare and uncelebrated, would become critical once the engagement unfolded, because panic did not announce itself loudly. It crept in through rushed decisions. Angle 2. Tactical reality. By the early years of the war, numerical superiority in the air was often misunderstood. 6 fighters against 1 suggested inevitability, but numbers only mattered if they could be applied simultaneously. Airspace, speed, and altitude limited how many aircraft could attack at once. Poor coordination could reduce 6 fighters to a sequence of isolated threats. He understood this. Formations looked solid from a distance. Up close, they were fragile systems held together by timing and trust. If one element accelerated too fast, another lagged behind. If altitude changed unexpectedly, sightlines broke. If pursuit became uneven, the formation dissolved into individuals. His goal was not to defeat 6 fighters. It was to make sure he never fought all 6 at the same time. This required restraint. He resisted the instinct to turn sharply or fire early. Instead, he shaped the engagement before it fully formed. Subtle throttle changes, shallow climbs, deliberate positioning that suggested vulnerability without surrendering control. To an aggressive enemy, this looked like opportunity. To him, it was setup. Angle 3. Technology and limits. No aircraft in the Second World War was invincible. Each carried compromises. Speed often came at the cost of turn radius. Climb rate drained fuel. Firepower added weight. Pilots who ignored these trade-offs rarely survived long. His aircraft, whatever its national markings, was not the best in all categories. It did not outturn every opponent. It did not climb forever. But it did one thing well. It retained energy. At higher speeds and in controlled dives, it held momentum longer than its pursuers expected. This characteristic, often overlooked in training, focused on turning combat, gave him an edge if he could force the fight into that regime. He had practiced this repeatedly. Not dramatic dives, not reckless plunges, measured descents that converted altitude into speed without bleeding control, small enough to appear defensive. Large enough to matter. Against pilots trained to expect turning engagements, this behavior created uncertainty, and uncertainty, once introduced, spread quickly. As the distance between aircraft closed, these 3 factors, emotional discipline, tactical shaping, and technological understanding, began to overlap. The encounter was no longer random. It was structured, and from the enemy's perspective, something about this lone aircraft did not behave as expected. Which brings us to how the opposing pilots interpreted what they saw. Angle 4. The enemy's perspective from the opposing cockpits. The situation appeared straightforward. A single aircraft ahead. Slightly lower, not accelerating aggressively. No sudden brake. No attempt to climb away at full power. To experienced pilots flying in a group of 6, this behavior signaled hesitation. They had seen it before. Lone fighters often froze when confronted by numbers. Some attempted desperate turns. Others fled too late, bleeding energy until they were easy prey. This one didn't either. He held course just long enough to appear unsure, then began a shallow adjustment that invited pursuit rather than escape. It looked like indecision. Confidence followed. The formation compressed slightly as the lead elements advanced. Wingmen focused forward, eyes locked on the solitary aircraft. Attention narrowed. In the excitement of imminent contact, discipline loosened. Small spacing errors crept in. Nothing dramatic, nothing alarming. Yet, in air combat, small errors were cumulative. What they did not realize was that the lone pilot was not reacting to them. He was anticipating them. Angle 5. Psychological misreading. Air combat psychology was shaped by patterns. Pilots learned to read behavior quickly because hesitation could be fatal. But this reliance on pattern recognition had a weakness. It assumed the enemy was thinking the same way. The Bookworm pilot exploited this quietly. His calm was interpreted as passivity. His lack of sharp maneuvering was mistaken for fear. When he delayed firing, they assumed he lacked confidence in his aim or his position. None of this was true. He was measuring. He waited until pursuit became uneven. Until one aircraft edged ahead, another fell slightly behind, and mutual support thinned just enough to matter. The enemy pilots believed they were closing a trap. In reality, they were stretching it. Psychologically, this mattered. Once pilots committed to an attack, reversing that decision became difficult. Momentum, both physical and mental, carried them forward. By the time doubt appeared, spacing had already broken. Angle 6, leadership and doctrine shaped expectations. Enemy leaders had trained their pilots to trust aggression and cohesion. Against isolated targets, the prescribed response was immediate pressure. Do not give the opponent time. Do not allow escape. Force a close engagement. This doctrine worked until it met someone who understood it intimately. The lone pilot had studied enemy manuals. He knew how formations were taught to behave. He understood the emphasis placed on closing distance and forcing a turning fight. His maneuvering was designed to trigger these exact responses. Leadership, in this case, became predictability. No individual enemy pilot was careless. They were competent, experienced, and confident, but they were operating within a framework that assumed the lone aircraft would eventually break. He had no intention of breaking. As the formation closed further, the airspace tightened. Speed increased. Options narrowed. The moment for shaping the fight was ending. The moment for execution was approaching. Engines roared louder. The sky, once wide, now felt confined. And in that narrowing space, the pilot made his move. The engagement began without ceremony. No dramatic dot, no sudden roll into attack. At approximately the moment the enemy formation crossed into effective firing distance, the lone aircraft altered its profile slightly, deliberately. The nose dipped just enough to gain speed. Not a full dive. Not yet, just enough to change the geometry of pursuit. To the enemy pilots, it looked like a mistake. They tightened further. The lead fighters accelerated, eager to close the gap. Those behind followed, but not perfectly. Speed differences emerged. Altitude varied by meters, then tens of meters. Lines that had been parallel began to bend. And the lone pilot felt it immediately. The aircraft responded exactly as he expected. Controls firm, airspeed climbing, engine within limits. He did not look back in panic. He checked reflections, shadow movement, relative motion. He counted seconds in his head, not because he was nervous, but because timing mattered. At this speed, turning sharply would bleed energy. He did not turn sharply. Instead, he extended the descent by moments longer than instinct would allow. Enemy tracers began to pass wide, not accurate, yet. They were firing too early, eager to claim position. He let them. Every round fired increased their fixation. Every second spent shooting reduced their patience. Then he pulled, not violently. Precisely, the aircraft climbed just enough to force a decision. The lead enemy fighters followed instinctively, pulling up to maintain firing angles. Those behind hesitated, too low to climb efficiently, too fast to turn cleanly. The formation fractured. This was the first break. He rolled through the top of the maneuver, not into a turn, but into a reposition. The sky inverted. The horizon slid across the canopy. Gravity pressed briefly, then released. Below him now, two enemy fighters crossed paths, one climbing too steeply, another leveling too late. Their spacing collapsed. He did not fire. Not yet. He dove again, steeper this time, converting altitude into speed with ruthless efficiency. His aircraft surged forward, past the engagement envelope they had expected. Suddenly, he was not retreating. He was passing through. Enemy pilots reacted with surprise. Some broke left. Some pulled harder. One overshot entirely, flashing past with no shot taken. Overshoot was fatal currency. The lone pilot leveled out just long enough to line up a single target. Isolated, slow, exposed. He squeezed the trigger in a short, controlled burst. No spray, no waste. The enemy aircraft lurched, then fell away, trailing smoke. He did not watch it go down. He was already moving. Behind him, confusion spread. The 6 fighters were no longer 6. They were individuals at different speeds, altitudes, and headings, each suddenly unsure of where the threat truly was. The trap had closed, and now the trick revealed itself fully. The sky had changed character. Moments earlier, it had been crowded, lines of approach, converging vectors, the pressure of numbers. Now it was fragmented. Aircraft moved in conflicting directions, each pilot reacting to a different perceived threat. This was the result he had planned for. The trick was not a single maneuver. It was a sequence, a chain of decisions designed to force overshoot, misalignment, and hesitation. The enemy believed they were chasing a retreating target. In reality, they'd been drawn into a narrowing energy trap. He stayed fast. Speed was safety. Speed was initiative. As one enemy fighter attempted to regain position from above, the lone pilot resisted the urge to climb after him. Instead, he stayed low for seconds longer, allowing the pursuer to bleed energy in a steep pull-up. When the enemy crested and slowed, he reversed direction beneath him. The move was subtle, not a sharp break, a calculated roll and climb timed precisely to intersect the enemy's downward path. For a brief instant, the tables turned. The hunter crossed into his gun sight. Another short burst. Another aircraft fell away. By now, radio discipline on the enemy side was breaking down. Calls overlapped. Warnings came too late. Each pilot saw only fragments of the fight, tracers from an unexpected angle, a friendly aircraft diving suddenly out of view. The remaining fighters attempted to regroup, but their spacing was gone. Altitude differences made coordination difficult. Trust eroded with every second of uncertainty. One pilot dove aggressively, trying to force a turning engagement. The lone pilot refused. He extended forward, let the enemy close too quickly, then reduced throttle just enough to invite another overshoot. Again, patience mattered. The enemy passed ahead, unable to slow in time. The lone pilot rolled behind him, staying just outside the turning circle, conserving energy. He did not chase tightly. He waited until the enemy's maneuver degraded. Then he fired. The sky grew quieter. Not silent, but less crowded. The 6 fighters were no longer a group. Some were damaged, some disengaged. Some had already fallen away beyond sight. The lone pilot checked his instruments. Fuel acceptable. Engine steady. Airframe intact. He did not pursue recklessly. The purpose of the engagement had been achieved. He had survived an encounter that doctrine said he should not. He had neutralized numerical superiority through understanding rather than force. As he turned away, climbing back toward safer altitude, the remaining enemy aircraft broke contact. Not because they lacked courage, but because the fight no longer made sense. The calculated trick had worked, and in the wake of confusion and smoke, the sky reclaimed its emptiness. What remained was the question of consequence, how this encounter would be recorded, understood, and absorbed by those who heard about it later. The return flight was uneventful. That alone was unusual. After engagements of this intensity, pilots often carried damage, overheated engines, punctured control surfaces, fuel leaks hidden until landing. He monitored his gauges carefully, listening for changes in tone or vibration. There were none. The aircraft held together exactly as designed. On the ground, the contrast was immediate. Mechanics noted the absence of damage. Intelligence officers noted the claims. Squadron mates noted something else entirely. The quiet way he reported the engagement. No embellishment, no raised voice. He described positions, timing, altitude changes. He explained what he had done and why, not as a lesson, but as a record. Some listened closely. Others exchanged glances. Enemy losses were later confirmed through multiple sources. Aircraft missing, damage reports, disrupted patrol schedules in the following days. The 6-fighter formation that had entered the fight did not return intact. Yet the engagement did not make headlines. There was no dramatic footage, no witnesses close enough to shape a legend. In a war crowded with large battles and massed formations, a single pilot's calculated defense was easy to overlook. Within the squadron, reactions varied. A few pilots quietly sought him out afterward, asked questions. Not about bravery, but about timing, about why he waited, about how he avoided being drawn into a turn. These conversations happened away from crowds near aircraft or over maps. Others dismissed it as circumstance. Luck, a favorable aircraft matchup, anything but method. Commanders reviewed the report carefully. They saw something that doctrine did not emphasize strongly enough, that numerical advantage could evaporate when misapplied, that aggression without structure could collapse into chaos, that a pilot trained to think could delay, shape, and control an engagement even when outnumbered. The engagement entered files, then archives, but its effects did not remain confined there. Because encounters like this accumulated quietly across the war, they altered expectations. They forced subtle adjustments in training syllabi, in tactical discussions, in the way pilots were advised to engage unknown opponents. And for the pilot himself, the aftermath was understated. No celebration, no sudden change in demeanor. He returned to his routines, studying, flying, observing, and observing. He defeated an assumption. That speed and numbers automatically meant control. His advantage was not secrecy or surprise, but clarity. He understood how machines behaved, how pilots thought, and how both reacted under pressure. This was not luck. It was preparation meeting opportunity. As the Second World War pushed technology forward, it demanded more from those who fought in the air. Faster aircraft reduced reaction time. Greater firepower punished mistakes instantly. In that environment, instinct alone became insufficient. Thought became a weapon. The lesson endures. In combat, in technology, and in history itself, those who are underestimated often carry the most dangerous advantage. They are not distracted by reputation. They are not rushed by expectation. They are free to wait, to observe, and to act only when the moment is shaped in their favor. See.